It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker and Lincoln Torch Club member, Tim Anderson. Tim Anderson grew up in Oakland, Nebraska, where he started his newspaper career at age 16 at the Oakland Independent. After graduating from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 1974, he worked for newspapers in Florida, New York, and Nebraska, and I think New York for the next 30 years, actually, including serving as news editor from New York Newsday and as the news design editor of the New York Times. In 2005, he left the newspaper business. I know, right? In 2005, he left the newspaper business in New York and returned to Nebraska to become an associate professor of journalism at UNL, retiring at the end of 2015. Tim met John Neihardt in 1972 when Neihardt was autographing copies of his memoir, All Is But a Beginning. More than 20 years later, after rereading Neihardt's Black Elk Speaks, Anderson was left with so many questions about the book and the author that he began researching Neihardt's life. Lonesome Dreamer, The Life of John G. Neihardt, published in August 2016 by University of Nebraska Press, represents the answers he found. A paperback edition of Lonesome Dreamer was released in 2020. His talk tonight emerged from the research he did for that book. Please join me in welcoming tonight's guest speaker, Tim Anderson, as he presents his paper, A New Life for Old Heroes.
Thank you, Sandy. I will also say that 22 of you have already responded to the survey, so we're well on our way to getting some answers there. So it's a crisp autumn morning in October of 1913. In the small town of Bancroft, Nebraska, John Neihardt, having just finished his breakfast, walks into his study and with a thick, soft pencil writes, "The year was 1823. With that brief line, Neihardt's professional career as a writer and poet changes forever. With that line, he stakes claim to a place and a period of American history that he believed, though crucial to the nation's very sense of itself, were often ignored. With that line, he turns his focus to an American theme and sets off to explore the area of the Great Plains with which he will come to be associated, the rich Missouri River country of fur traders and Plains Indians. He is not even aware of it himself, but he is starting what will become his life's work. The tale he began to write that October morning was The Song of Hugh Glass, a biography in verse of a grizzled old fur trapper who had traveled up the Missouri River some 90 years earlier with a rugged band of men under the direction of William Ashley and Andrew Henry. Hugh Glass had been badly mauled by a bear on that expedition and left for dead by his compatriots. But he had survived, and living primarily on roots and berries, he'd made his way down the Grand River in what would become South Dakota, crawling on his hands and knees much of the way until he reached Fort Kiowa. You may be familiar with Glass's story through Leonardo DiCaprio's Oscar-winning portrayal of him in the 2015 film The Revenant. In 1913, John Neihardt was 32 years old, and already the author of 4 volumes of poetry, a novel, a volume of short stories, and a nonfiction account of his own Missouri River voyage. He had expected by this time to be working on a long dramatic poem about the French Revolution, an idea that had long attracted him. For the previous decade, he had focused on the writing of lyric poems and short stories, but he had grown bored with both. He wanted a large topic suitable for an extended drama, what he called a poem of ideas, and the French Revolution was to be it. But then sometime that fall, Neihardt told his wife, Mona, the story of Hugh Glass. It was a story he knew well. Neihardt may have first heard of Glass as a boy growing up in Kansas City, when he and his father would walk along the city's docks, listening to the old men there spinning yarns, tales of fur trappers and their excursions to some faraway place called Fort Benton, Montana. But there is no doubt that Glass was one of the names that Neihardt came across during his research for his trip down the Missouri River, a voyage in 1908 that would result in a book he called The River and I. Neihardt was attracted to Glass's story because, in his words, it made it possible to comment on every phase of life. He was especially drawn to Glass's near-death journey to Fort Kiowa, in which Neihardt saw represented the difficult striving he believed each person faces in life, an idea that would recur throughout his writings. Life might be difficult, nearly impossible at times, but he believed people must never give up, that the glory was not in the succeeding, but in the trying. Glass's story seemed the perfect vehicle for this message. Neihardt clearly liked the story. It seized my imagination, he said, and he apparently told it to his wife with such relish that her response was quick and to the point. Save that old man for posterity, John. Forget the French Revolution and write about Hugh Glass instead. Neihardt would later remember her telling him, "This is right under your feet." John Neihardt couldn't have imagined the task he was undertaking that day. Almost as soon as he began writing Hugh Glass's story, Neihardt decided it would be only the first of several long narrative poems he would write that would, in the end, form an epic, heroic cycle. Though the number of poems and their subjects would change slightly over the years, by the time Neihardt was finished, he would write 5 volumes. First, The Song of Hugh Glass, which showcased the indomitable courage and spirit of a man left for dead who must make his own way back to civilization. The centerpiece of the poem is a section Neihardt called The Crawl, and as if to underscore the idea that it's the journey, not the destination, that's important, the section takes up nearly half of the poem. The book was published in 1915. The second book, The Song of Three Friends, recounted the essentially true tale of Mike Fink, Will Carpenter, and Frank Talbot, also members of the Ashley Henry expedition. Fink and Carpenter were known for a stunt in which they would shoot a tin cup of whiskey off one another's heads. They both fell in love with the same woman, though, and the next time they tried the stunt, Fink shot Carpenter instead of the cup, killing him instantly. In Neihardt's retelling of the tale, Talbot, seeking revenge, then sets off in pursuit of Fink, forcing him on a painful journey of self-discovery, at the end of which he is able to transcend his own humanity. Though Neihardt created this aspect of the story, in reality Talbot had simply shot and killed Fink at one point. He always believed it was not the facts of a story that mattered so much as the truth of it. Friends was published in 1919. With the third volume, The Song of the Indian Wars, Neihardt traded the fur trade for the key battles between the U.S. Army and the native resistance on the plains. He had visited battle sites, had read widely on the subject, and had interviewed survivors from both sides. Though Neihardt sought to treat both the soldiers and the Indians fairly in his telling of this history, and though it was clear that Neihardt truly admired the Indians as fighters and as orators, it was equally obvious that at this point, Neihardt still saw native culture as vanishing, that he related to them primarily as historical figures. The Indian Wars was published in 1925. The fourth book, The Song of the Messiah, was originally intended to simply be a part of the Song of the Indian Wars. As part of his research, he traveled to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in hopes of finding someone who might have helped promote the ghost dance movement, a religious movement that swept through the Western tribes during the late 1880s. he ended up meeting Nicholas Black Elk, a Lakota man in his 70s who had witnessed firsthand many of the interactions between his tribe and the U.S. Army that took place on the Great Plains in the last half of the 19th century, from the Battle of the Little Bighorn to the Ghost Dance Movement to the Wounded Knee Massacre. Black Elk's insights, and especially the bond that quickly developed between Neihardt and Black Elk, altered the way Neihardt thought about the nation's indigenous population. This change was evident in the book that resulted from their meeting, Black Elk Speaks, as well as the contributions Black Elk made to the Song of the Messiah. Neihardt acknowledged that if he had produced Messiah earlier, it would have been written only from the white man's consciousness. Black Elk Speaks and Other Responsibilities, Neihardt was literary editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch at the time, delayed completion of Messiah, and it wasn't published until 1935. With the fifth and final book in the series, The Song of Jed Smith, Neihardt traveled the farthest from his Missouri River, reaching across the Rockies and the western deserts to the west coast. Several times he had thought he was ready to begin writing the story of Jed Smith, another of the Ashley Henry men, one whose exploits Neihardt believed placed him above all other explorers of the American West. But his wife, Mona, who had encouraged him to write about Hugh Glass, had always cautioned him to wait on Smith, telling him she didn't think he was ready. Finally, in October 1937, 24 years after beginning the Song of Hugh Glass, Neihardt began creating a trio of characters who sit around a campfire and reminisce about Smith as a way of telling his story. Jed Smith was published in 1941. In a writing career that would span more than 7 decades, roughly half of Neihardt's time would be spent on these 5 poems. He would eventually publish books, not counting reissued volumes, in 6 of the 7 decades in which he lived in the 20th century, skipping only the 1960s when he was in his 80s, a decade that would be marked by the explosive republication of the book for which he is today best remembered, Black Elk Speaks, itself, as you've just heard, a byproduct of his work on these poems. Neihardt believed that these 5 books would be his claim to fame, his work that would be most likely to endure. Certainly there were times during the 3 decades that he worked on these poems that made this seem likely. 2 of the poems earned him top national honors in the years they were published, the Song of Three Friends in 1919 and the Song of the Messiah in 1935. At least twice, once for the Song of the Indian Wars and again for the Song of the Messiah, various critics suggested, unsuccessfully, that Neihardt should win the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. In 1921, about midway between Three Friends and Indian Wars, Neihardt was named Nebraska's Poet Laureate, in large part because of his poems celebrating the Great Plains. This spring, Neihardt fans and followers will celebrate the centennial of this honor. And yet, from the first book through the last, readers and critics were torn. Neihardt never received anything but praise for the subjects he had chosen, for telling, and in some cases, for preserving stories of those who had explored the West and those who had fought over its territory. The New York Times, for example, when reviewing the Song of Hugh Glass, said, "Mr. Neihardt has uncovered a rich mine in the annals of the explorer and fur trader and tells his story with dramatic effect." Early on in the project, newspapers and magazines began to feature articles about Neihardt and his plans. The Los Angeles Times, in an article shortly after Three Friends was published, called Neihardt the voice of the prairie and of the mountain and of the heroes who passed that way. Another essay praised Neihardt as the epic poet of the pioneer West. The Song of the Indian Wars earned Neihardt his best reviews. One reviewer declared it an almost unparalleled achievement, a successful, long historical poem. Arthur Giederman, a co-founder of the Poetry Society of America, said, Mr. Neihart's Red Cloud, Man Afraid, Spotted Tail, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse are no cigar store Indians, savage fiends, or noble bronze statues, but men revealed as men in peace and war, men whose lives you can relive, whose hearts you can enter and share. Their motives are made plain, their speeches in council are natural, trenchant, and convincing. The Song of the Messiah was met with much the same reaction. Reviewers generally were supportive, and in 1936, it earned for Neihardt the Gold Scroll Medal of Honor as the foremost poet of the nation by the National Poetry Center in New York. But the praise he received for these poems told only half the story. For if Neihardt had been lauded for taking chances with the subject matter of his poems, reviewers generally responded quite differently when it came to the form he had chosen, rhymed pentameter. Although there were always some critics who found the form appropriate, or at least found that it didn't detract from the power of the tales being told, over the years, as the subsequent volumes were published, more and more critics had found Neihardt's chosen form shop-worn. Neihardt was writing at a time of great experimentation and change in American poetry, and he was ignoring it all, sticking to forms of a different time. Poetry magazine, for one, soundly criticized Neihardt for the form he chose for the poems. He has fitted the story to the measure instead of letting it choose its form, it said, and somehow the nobility and high-sounding rotundity of the poem do not satisfy us. Such art smells of the old-time theater. Such negative reviews meant that, in the end, Neihardt did not get the response that he had hoped for. Yet he never expressed any regret in having written what he did the way he did. Not in any of the thousands of book reviews and features he wrote for newspapers, in which he kept up a steady drumbeat of criticism of the modernist tendencies of other poets and critics. Not in the never-ending schedule of lectures and readings he gave from coast to coast to supplement his income. Not in the thousands of letters he wrote to family and friends. He always seemed satisfied that no matter how disappointed he was at the reception, he had done what he set out to do. So why did Neihardt strike out in such a new direction when it came to the content of his poetry, and yet remain so faithful to the approaches of long-dead poets? To understand why Neihardt wrote what he did the way he did, it is important to identify his influences, both in terms of his subjects and in his choice of form, because to Neihardt the two were inextricably linked. In Neihardt's mind, the subject virtually demanded the form. Neihardt subscribed to a theory of universal history that contained three divisions: the factual, the philosophical, and the epic. America, Neihardt believed, had the necessary raw materials for all three parts of this universal history, and he was attracted to the idea of an American epic in which a poet could dramatize the heroic events of the nation's history, perhaps especially those events that he thought were too often overlooked. He believed that in the stories of the fur traders of the Old Northwest, and in the collision of cultures that culminated in the Plains Indian Wars, he had found the stuff of America's epic. We have often heard it said that America lacks the fine old traditions, he wrote the year before he started work on the Song of Hugh Glass. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Considering merely the fur trade era, we find men that Homer would have turned into demigods. It is no surprise that Neihardt mentions Homer, whom the ancient Greeks believed was the first and greatest of the epic poets. Neihardt's first encounter with Homer had come as a young boy in Kansas City, when he became friends with a neighborhood schoolmate whose mother often read to the two boys. I think I heard most of the Iliad and Odyssey from her, Neihardt recalled. As he got older, of course, he read English translations of Homer himself, and the Greek poems eventually offered him a way to view stories of other cultures, fur trappers, plains Indians, and soldiers, for example. We can't say with any certainty where Neihart's precise word choice and writing style came from, but we know what he read and we know what he wrote, and it's often easy to find parallels between the two. Homer, at least in translation, seems to have offered Neihardt a language in which to express the stories he wanted to tell. What he heard in his head as he thought of these brave fighters and adventurers were extended similes like those used by Homer and his 18th century translator Alexander Pope, concrete comparisons that often relied on the basic elements of earth, air, water, and fire, elements that were equally prevalent on the Great Plains. As he wrote the various poems, Neihardt often used similar figures of speech, his favorite metaphorical expression being that of a prairie fire, something he had experienced as a boy in northwest Kansas while living with his grandparents. No poet, however, had the impact on Neihardt that Alfred, Lord Tennyson, did. Neihardt's relationship with Tennyson, perhaps the most representative Victorian poet, began at an early age, and though dozens of other poets came and went, Tennyson's place in Neihardt's heart was always secure. Neihardt had first discovered Tennyson as a schoolboy, while reading hungrily from a random assortment of books near his teacher's desk. I was fascinated, he later recalled, by the way common words could be put together and made to sing while they were working. The way Tennyson wrote, the way he moved fighting men across the page, especially caught Neihardt's eye and ear. To Neihardt, though he eventually recognized sentimentality in some of the poet's work, Tennyson always remained the consummate artist, the Virgil of English poetry. Tennyson, by the time Neihardt was writing his own epic poetry, had gone out of fashion, and Neihardt accepted that. But, he believed, Tennyson will come back again, because he voiced great lyric moods that are, as time has amply proven, inevitable in the constitution of human nature. The time would come when Neihardt would feel the same way about his own work and his own time. To Neihardt, the power of the stories he recounted could not be separated from the power of their platforms. When it came to form, just like when it came to the commemorating of heroes, Neihardt believed it was best to follow the old masters. To him, these poets were part of a noble tradition, and to ignore them was a mistake. Neihardt had experimented with forms in many of his earlier lyric poems, trying blank verse and mimicking chants he had heard on the Omaha Indian Reservation. But he had always been most comfortable with the forms he had grown up with, like those used by his early poetic heroes, especially Tennyson. Neihardt chose pentameter for his long poetry because, for sustained narrative, it best suits the genius of the English language, he said, as hexameter suited that of the Greek. And he had a reason for the rhyme as well. Rhyme makes for economy and speed, he said, and gives a sort of come-on to a tale. In April 1949, 8 years after the last poem in the series was completed, the 5 books were published as a single volume called A Cycle of the West. This unified publication allowed reviewers an opportunity to look back at the songs, the earliest of which, the Song of Hugh Glass, had been published 35 years earlier, and to critique what was essentially a lifetime of work. Given the decades critics had had to consider the various poems of the cycle, even the best reviews were of two minds. The stories were gripping, but the poetic technique seemed even more old-fashioned now than it had when the individual books had been published. In one representative critique, the New York Herald Tribune, though it called the stories memorable, found the verse occasionally a bit thinner than the deeds chronicled. Although some of the regional reviewers were kinder, most of the larger newspapers responded the way the New York Times Book Review did. Calling Neihardt a writer of immense vitality, the author concluded, he is an unfinished and unpolished writer, and worst of all, falls into dreadful archaisms. Although Neihardt said little at the time to friends, most of whom were wholly supportive, he was deeply disappointed at the critical reception to A Cycle of the West. The general response represented what he called a time of crisis in his life, leaving him with a sense that he had died, in his words, without the comfort of a funeral. Knowing that his life's work was finished and that it was so little appreciated, he told a friend years later, made it feel like a voice that had fallen echoless unto empty air, leaving nothing to fill the emptiness it had left. Still, Neihardt was never one to feel bad for long. Just as his cycle was published, he was invited to teach at the University of Missouri, and the opportunity to do something different was life-saving. The depth of his despair over the reception to the collected cycle indicated the extent to which he had constructed a wall of self-confidence in his art, necessary for the creation of it, but dangerous when it came to judging it. As he wrote years later about this moment in his life, apparently there was only one of two things I could do: honestly acknowledge my virtual decease or begin a new life. What he had always wanted was for his work to endure, and for most of his career, he had thought his most lasting work would be his Cycle of the West. For nearly 4 decades, he had believed the cycle would endure long after he was gone, that readers eventually would flock to it, and he would be thought of in the same way he thought of Tennyson. His heroes would lead readers across the pages of his poetry, and he would preserve their exploits and, more important, their values for all time. When it did not happen, at least not to the extent he had hoped for, he was understandably devastated. But then, quietly but quickly, he moved on. Whether he ever consciously thought of it this way, he was following his own philosophy, putting into practice the ideas that had attracted him to the story of Hugh Glass in the first place. He had spent more than 30 years on a project that meant the world to him. He had been honored at times for the work, praised by some and dismissed by others. But through it all, he had done it precisely the way he had wanted to. In the end, he had, no matter the response, gloried in the creation of his work. Now, with that behind him, he simply began teaching his students, making a textbook of his beloved Cycle of the West, and turning a new generation onto Jed Smith and Hugh Glass, onto Crazy Horse and Red Cloud. Thank you very much.
That was amazing. That was an incredible paper. Thank you, Tim, for that. We're going to open this up for questions, a question and answer period. And again, the question and answer period will be recorded. If you forget and you don't want to be involved in that, you're welcome to let us know and we'll try to edit that back out. But we welcome everyone's participation. I think we'll try to keep the questions live and on audio rather than through chat. So if you don't mind doing it that way, we'd appreciate that. So we'll open it up for questions. But thank you again, Tim. That was a remarkable paper.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I knew nothing about Neihardt other than Black Elk Speaks, and I wondered what caught you to make you work on this paper.
You know, most of us think of John Neihardt as a really old man because that's when he was back in Lincoln. You know, he was in his late 80s and early 90s. You know, he was this little hobbit-looking creature. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about working on the book and on this paper was he was young, of course, at one point, and he was incredibly hardworking, wrote a lot of things, and was was pretty emotional about it. And so I was really intrigued. When I started working on it, I was drawn to him through Black Elk Speaks. But it didn't take very much research for me to find that he always considered Black Elk Speaks to be kind of an offshoot of his main work, which was the Cycle of the West, which nobody today, even though it's still in print because the University of Nebraska Press keeps all of his books in print, nobody reads it. Um, and it's not particularly well thought of or anything. And so I was really intrigued by what that would feel like to devote 35 years of your life to something that was that important to you and then have people, kind of ignore it at best or criticize it. And I was able to find some letters in which he talked about it and discussed just how devastating it was for him. And they
Wow.
are. I've read the Cycle of the West, probably 8 times, and it always hits me kind of like watching British movies or television shows. You can't understand, even though they're speaking English, you can't understand the first 20 minutes of it. And that's the way, whenever I read one of these long book length poems, the first 10 pages are just random words stuck together. I can't make it sing at all. And then you get into the rhythm of it, and it's quite enjoyable. I enjoy reading them.
I guess what I would like to know, I'm not a great student of poetry, and I'm embarrassed to say, but it is true. Who else was writing in pentameter with rhymes at that point? In
Uh,
that, in that
Pretty much nobody. I
really?
mean, it was the
Okay.
time really of great change in American poetry. Um, and Neihardt didn't like any of the modern stuff. He didn't like Cubist painting. He didn't like Imagist uh, poetry. Ezra Pound. Uh, Briefly, early in their careers, Ezra Pound and Neihardt were actually slightly friendly toward one another, but that really didn't last. And once these poems, the cycle poems, started to be published, um, Ezra Pound hated him, and Neihardt hated Ezra Pound, and Ezra Pound was in very tight with Poetry Magazine, which was headquartered in Chicago, and Harriet Monroe, who ran that magazine, really tried to be friendly to all poets who were publishing at the time. She didn't really want to, upset anyone, and Pound was mailing her letters left and right saying, "Don't publish this guy. He's just awful, and he's old-fashioned," and so it was kind of nasty.
Yeah. Hmm.
Pound was known to be a nasty man.
Yeah, he was. Yeah,
Oh,
Scott.
was he?
Yeah,
I had not known that.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. He's really a nasty, nasty guy.
Scott.
Um, Ezra Pound he had his crotchet. Well, Evelyn can speak to this too, but he was very generous too and very encouraged a lot of people. And but he did want poetry in English to change, and so he was a campaigner. I mean, he um, he advocated for what he wanted to advocate for, and he could be a harsh critic.
Yeah. Well,
But
he was a part. He knew a lot of other poets, and you're right. He was very helpful to younger poets coming along and helping getting people published. And I've often wondered, Neihardt was out here in Bancroft, and then later in Missouri, all by himself. He was never a part of any school, any group of poets. He had some poets that he was friendly with that he wrote to, but he didn't get any personal criticism. He didn't show his stuff to anybody until it was published. And I'm always wondering if he had been in a group of people, if that might have changed his attitude a little bit. You know, if he might have written in a more modernist way.
Yeah.
But we'll never know. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
I also had an observation and a question. As far as someone else doing something relatively comparable, I thought of Stephen Vincent Benet, who also wrote poems about American history, but in a relatively traditional
Right.
form. But I was wondering, since you're the biographer of Neihardt, are there moments in the Cycle of the West where there's biographical, personal? Does Neihardt kind of keep himself entirely out of the poem, or are there moments where you kind of sense his presence and his point of view?
Not really. He was criticized, the two Indian poems, Indian Wars and Messiah, he was criticized for not taking a side, because one of the things he liked about some of the early Greek poetry was that they liked brave men, and they could be brave on either side of the battle. And that's kind of the way he looked at it. He thought brave American soldiers were great, and he thought brave Indian warriors were great. And a lot of the critics thought, okay, if you want to be for the Indians, be for the Indians, but then don't also praise the cavalry. And so there's parts of his philosophy showed up, but there's, other than this repeated use of the prairie fire, which he did experience as a child, there are not really any personal details. The three books that are about fur trappers are the ones that he tended to exaggerate slightly, as I mentioned with the Mike Fink tale, creating this where Talbot chases Fink through the countryside, which didn't happen. But in the two Indian poems, I always sort of suspected that he found those stories so dramatic already that he didn't have to enhance them in any way. Those two poems adhere closer to the truth, and probably my favorite section is in Song of the Indian Wars, The Death of Crazy Horse, which he worked off a specific recollection written by a U.S. cavalry officer. And in my book, I compare a few sections of what that officer wrote to how Neihardt then turned that into poetry. And he really tried to stay pretty close to, the truth there, where he didn't feel like he had to exaggerate Crazy Horse or Red Cloud to make them seem larger than life. They kind of were larger than life.
Yeah, I wondered, did Neihardt have any opinions on Kipling?
Not that I ever came across. No, I read 3,000 book reviews that he wrote, and I don't believe he ever reviewed a book by Kipling.
Well, he liked Tennyson and he liked heroic poetry. I just thought Kipling would fit into the mold.
Yeah, he certainly might. Yeah.
When I was in high school, the high school I went to, which was fairly conservative, had a specific work that was done in the English class each year. And for the sophomore year, it was the Song of Hugh Glass. And I don't know, it was a terrific ordeal for someone as a sophomore in high school to read. And I don't remember any of the details except that it was the most awesome thing I ever read. And I think in addition to the film you mentioned with Leon DiCaprio, there was another film called Little Big Man.
Right.
I think was based on the Song of Hugh Glass. But the Song of Hugh Glass, it went on, we read it for weeks, and it just didn't seem like humans could do that and survive. It left an impression on me that I don't remember all the iambics and all that sort of jazz about it, but it was a gripping story.
Yeah, it was Hugh Glass and three friends were actually taught in Nebraska high schools
Yes,
for years.
they were required reading,
And I
and
can imagine it would have been an ordeal for a high school kid to get through it. But it's, there's some very powerful passages in it. And the crawl part of Hugh Glass, where he makes his way really from the northwest
oh,
corner to the southeast corner of South Dakota, uh, is just unimaginable. I mean, but we know that actually happened.
yeah, didn't he end up in the skin of an animal that he ate at one point?
Well, yeah, there's parts of that. He came across a campfire that somebody had abandoned, and yeah, they were tough.
Unfortunately, it was introduced by our teacher as something required by the State Board of Education, and she wasn't sure why. And then we sallied forth into it.
Just to make it that much more enjoyable.
Yeah, right.
I remember when I was 15, he came to Lincoln Southeast, and let's see when that would have been, 67, I think.
Mhm.
67, maybe 68. I felt, unlike so many other memories from high school, that I was in the presence of a very great man. And it wasn't that he was wizened and hobbled over, etc. It was, I don't know, maybe a spirit around him. It's hard to say. But I was in awe. I
had
he'd written at that point, of course, but we didn't have to read him. We probably should have, but so
he did a lot of public speaking, beginning when he was a young poet, really for the income that it provided. And I found in researching him, of course, he began public speaking before there were any public address systems. So you would go into a high school or a college auditorium, and you had to speak from the stage and reach the people in the last row. And he had read some advice from Teddy Roosevelt, which was to draw out all the vowel sounds, like exaggerate those, and clip off the consonants. And when I first heard him speak, and then I've listened to dozens and dozens of tapes and watched videos of him, and I realized that he sounds so different from anybody else we might listen to, because he really speaks like he's from the 19th century. I mean, he really got his speaking style before microphones and before speakers. And he has this sort of otherworldly way. He was interviewed by Dick Cavett in 1971, and it was aired then and again in 72. And it's just an awesome program. And you can tell that Dick Cavett, who's used to interviewing, Katharine Hepburn and Groucho Marx and all these, big famous people, kind of loses his place in the interview. He's so drawn to what Neihart's talking about. And at that point, Neihart was 91 years old. And so at the end and when he answers a question, he's pretty sharp. And then in between the questions, he all of a sudden sounds like a 91-year-old man. He's he's kind of lost, and he's not sure he's got the right pair of glasses on, and not quite sure what Cavett is saying. And then Cavett asks him to recite this Death of Crazy Horse, which is like 8 or 9 pages of poetry, which he does from memory, with only maybe one small misstep. And at the end of it, he's just drained. Like he can't even really, Cavett says something to him, and he can't even really respond. And it reminded me of seeing, terrific Broadway performances where the actors come out for their curtain call and they're still shaking and crying from the performance they've just given. That's sort of what it reminded me of. It's yeah, he's quite a character.
Now, Tim, did you see that on YouTube or what? That interview with Cavett?
Some of it is available on YouTube. It's available on DVD. which I have, Cavett and the Nyhart Center. I think Cavett gave the rights of it to the Nyhart Center in Bancroft a few years ago, so they've manufactured it and sell it. But it's you can find pieces of it on YouTube.
So do you think
Tim-
you had the same interest in Nyhart had he, let's say he was from and lived in Louisiana, do you think you would have had the same interest?
No, probably not. No, I when I undertook to write the book, I really knew Black Elk Speaks and this memoir that I bought a copy of his memoir at an event in Lincoln in 1972, and he autographed it to me, which I still have. And those were the only two things I'd read by him. But I was so intrigued by Black Elk Speaks when I reread it in '95 that I started researching his life. And his daughter Hilda was still alive then, and she was just enthusiastic in her cooperation. Started sending me books and letters and videotapes and audio tapes. I was still living in New York then, and she was so taken with the idea that somebody would write this. And the more I researched him, the more parallels I found. You know, he lived for 20 years in Bancroft. I lived for almost 20 years in Oakland, 25 miles away. So I knew the area well. He worked for a weekly newspaper for a while. So did I. He worked for a daily newspaper for most of his adult life. So did I. So there were a lot of things that I found, connections to. Now, he obviously was born in 1881, long before I was. But yeah, I really came to admire him as a person, not as much as a poet. Like I don't, his family understandably thinks he's one of America's greatest poets, and I can't quite share that sentiment, but he did write with great vitality, and he's pretty entertaining.
A good talk, good paper.
Thank you.
Yes, yes,
Congratulations.
yes.
Absolutely. Tim, is there any information? I know you made reference and we've talked about it, but the Bancroft Center, the Nyhart Bancroft Center, is it open for people to join or to look in on as a website?
Yeah, there is the Nyhart Center. If you search for it, they do have a website that's pretty nice. They have been closed because of COVID, but they are reopening on March 2nd. On April 24th, they will have their spring conference, which is they have two large events every year: a spring conference in April and Nyhart Day in August. August is outside and is a little more of a fun event. You usually have some Indian dancers and things like that. The April event is more scholarly. So this year they're looking at other Nebraska writers who were writing at the same time Nyhart was.
Oh,
Lauren Isley and Mari Sandoz, and I forget who else. And I'll be moderating the day's events
good.
there. I'm not speaking, but I'll be moderating. But there is a Nyhart Foundation, which is very reasonably priced to join. But anybody can come to these events. And the April event, they're hoping to have in person, but it will also be offered via Zoom. I think it costs maybe $25 to either come in person or to see it over Zoom.
It's a wonderful museum. I joined it and I went there and I loved it.
Yeah, it
I
really
still
is
get
quite a
material,
nice.
so-
It's a branch of the State Historical Society, History Nebraska.
Yeah. What,
Fun.
Tim,
Yeah,
what is the name of your book again?
Lonesome Dreamer,
Lonesome Dreamer?
which
Now,
is
that's the second book, right, that you've written?
no, that's the one and only book I've written so far.
Oh, okay.
And Lonesome Dreamer is a line from one of his lyric poems where he kind of writes about growing up in he lived in Wayne, Nebraska as a child for a while and went to elementary school there, and I think really felt like an outcast because he was into poetry from the time he was 11. And that's what all
Wow.
he wanted to be, was to be a poet. So
Yeah,
he, I think he was self-identified as a lonesome dreamer.
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Tim presented for us, I believe it was in 2017 or 2018. What was the title of the paper then, Tim?
I don't remember for sure. It was about Joseph LaFleche, about make-believe white men's village or something.
Yeah, it was excellent as well. And Tim may still have, I don't know if you do or not, I shouldn't speak, but you might still have a hardbound copy as well of Lonesome Dreamer.
I believe I
Maybe.
do. Yeah.
But if not, he does have paper books that just were published and released in 2020.
Right.
And
It's
since
available
you
on
know,
Amazon and
yeah, but you might find a way to get, I have my copy is autographed. I don't know.
I do
Just
have,
saying.
it
But
looks
anyway,
like I
Tim,
have
that
2
was,
hardback and 3
Yeah.
paperback.
oh, there you go.
Yeah.
There you
Wow.
go. So anyway, that was again remarkable. We thank you
Thank you.
Yes.
for
My
a
pleasure.
remarkable paper. Remarkable is the word for the night for that paper. So thank you again for presenting.
Thank you.